So Dave, you recently wrote a piece inspired by this tornado cash sanctioning and what Rosie identified as, I think, a really key new step from OFAC, which is not just sanctioning individuals, but actually sanctioning code itself. So why did you write the piece, and what are the key takeaways for the audience from this piece?
Yeah, so like you said, it was very inspired by the developments with the tornado cash situation, where I think there was a lot of, it really gets to the core of this idea of decentralization. So a lot of people were, I think, surprised by the tornado cash situation because, you know, this is a decentralized technology. How could it be sanctioned and frozen in this manner? My reaction, I think Unbounded Capital's reaction, was that this was totally expected, and actually it'll go one step further, although it's a major step. So the companies like Circle or Kraken, which complied with the Treasury, unsurprisingly, you know, the big businesses, they want to be compliant, and froze those tornado cash assets. That's one thing, but we think that the next step will be layer 1 companies, or companies which actually maintain and provide the blockchain itself. So companies like miners, which could be compelled to reassign proceeds of crime that are identified on-chain to a government-controlled wallet as part of an asset seizure. So I think it's an important topic because it's a topic which would surprise many in the crypto blockchain space with a more consensus point of view, and would really question the value proposition put forward and kind of implied by decentralization, which is this idea of censorship resistance.
So pause for a second. How would you define decentralization?
So there's a technical, like, you know, meaning of decentralization, and then there's also this idea of like being a distributed network. So I think, you know, decentralization is very in vogue, as you showed in your presentation. You know, DeFi, DeSo, DAOs, all these decentralized terms. What they're really saying is there's no main party that's responsible or accountable for maintaining this service. And the implication there, although it's often made explicit also, is that because there's no accountable party, the government has no one to go to say, like, you have to do X, Y, or Z. So it's, you know, robust to this like government interference. I think at Unbounded Capital, we're much more interested in a distributed network. So an example of that would be like Amazon Web Services. So this is a centralized company. There's a CEO. They have, you know, a tax ID. They pay taxes. But they're very distributed from a network architecture point of view, where if one data center goes down, the whole internet doesn't collapse, and, you know, the service is still useful.
Yeah. So why is BTC not actually decentralized?
Right. So this is kind of the crux of the piece. So there's this idea that there's, you know, thousands of nodes out there. Everyone is validating their own transactions, and because of that, the network is decentralized and resistant to government in this type of way. But the reality, if you just look up the breakdown of blocks mined on the BTC network, and this is true also of Ethereum and other blockchains, is that there are a handful of companies which are mining pools which end up producing the majority of blocks. So the top 3 mining pools on BTC account for over 51% of the network, and then the top 6, which I write in the piece, is 84%. So despite there being, you know, this long tail of smaller nodes that are operating on the network, it really has this power law where at the top there's a handful of companies which provide the service of creating and maintaining the BTC blockchain. The implication of that, of course, being that, you know, if the government needs to contact somebody in the same manner that it contacted Kraken or Circle, you know, through their address and their legal counsel, these are big, you know, billion-dollar revenue companies that can be accessed in the same way. So what does that mean? You know, could they comply with government in the same way that Circle and Kraken did, is the question.
Yeah. So how would the government actually do this? Maybe talk a little bit more about what OFAC did with Tornado Cash, and then maybe how something could look like in the future with, you know, directly seizing. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, by adding with Tornado Cash, by adding these addresses to the SDN list, they made it so that any layer 2 company won't interact with it. So, you know, if these addresses are if they try to transact with a Kraken or a Circle or a Coinbase, those companies want to remain compliant, and they're not going to, you know, allow the transfer of those sanctioned addresses. So what's interesting about what could happen with the layer 1 companies like mining pools is they can really comply in the same manner. So a lot of people in BTC would suggest that if the government came knocking on, you know, Foundry USA is one of the biggest mining pools currently. If the government came knocking on their door and said, hey, these addresses on the blockchain, these are part of a drug market, you have to reassign these from the current owner to this address that is controlled by the DOJ. The common opinion is that that would be impossible because they would need to get the private key. So they'd have to identify the person, arrest him, compel the individual to give them their key, and then use the BTC network in the same way. There's no reason technically on the BTC network or Ethereum or other networks why you would actually need a private key so long as you have the majority of miners. So like I said, this is 3 companies. You could very safely do it with 6 companies. You have 84% of the network. And if the government, working with different law enforcement agencies, goes to a Foundry USA or a Poolin and says, these are proceeds of crime, here's our indictment, they go through the full legal process, those companies could work in conjunction with each other, kind of like coordinated by the government to take the proceeds of crime and then transfer them to a government.
Like with what happens today with banks, where if you find that there's a terrorist or drug dealer bank account,
right.
Governments work together in coordination with the banks to seize the funds. So how does that work practically, though? Because I think there's a widespread misconception that you just can't do that with Bitcoin, you can't do that
right.
with Ethereum. What does it actually look like?
So it is exactly like the process with banks. If you look at the asset forfeiture policy manual, which is like a document put out by the DOJ, they actually have a section on cryptocurrency seizure. The first option is obviously just like arresting someone, taking their keys, and then using the network the way it's intended. The other option is like going to a company like Circle in the same way you would go to a bank to seize assets from a customer of that service that is breaking the law. But there's this implication in it, which I think if you read between the lines, they talk about companies which don't have access to the private keys, which will comply with court orders. So if you go to a Foundry USA, you don't have the private keys, but here's $1 billion from a drug market. We need to get this seized by the government. Really what the process there looks like is just you have to come to a consensus with the other miners in the network to agree at what time this transfer from address X to address Y would occur. And as long as it's done at the same time, they're going to maintain consensus. So the Bitcoin network is made to make doing this unilaterally impossible so that a dishonest actor couldn't take funds and effectively steal them. But when the coordination is done by this layer of law enforcement and government cooperation, then all the big miners can stay on the same page and remain in consensus.
So to be clear, you're outlining a way that miners could process a Bitcoin transaction without the private keys and change the funds from one address to another.
Right, so long as it's done in consensus with the majority of the network, that is technically possible. And then the question is well, how would we all get in consensus to do this? And the dishonest way it's very unlikely to do it dishonestly. Even like a cartel of miners deciding we're gonna steal funds today for some reason. That's very unlikely because their incentives are not to do that.
Yeah.
But when law enforcement is coordinating the action, the incentives kind of flip.
So show of hands here. Who thinks that if the blockchain of your choice that you like, if governments compelled companies that use that blockchain to reassign funds, the value of that blockchain would go away? Yeah, we got some hands here. So what Dave is arguing here is that, one, that is extremely likely to happen with BTC and potentially other blockchains in the coming years. And two, that we still think that there is a lot of value to blockchain outside of being able to be resistant to government and law in perpetuity.
Yeah, let me make it a little bit more concrete too.
Yeah.
So, and I outlined this in the piece, it's up on our website. So last April, the United States, in conjunction with Germany, issued I think it was an indictment against a dark web market for drugs called Hydra. So they arrested the operator of the market, they seized the servers, it's no longer operational, but they only got $25 million in assets from the operator of the site. Their number that they put in the press release from the Treasury's website is that there's $5 billion of money that's gone through this drug market. So, I think these law enforcement agencies will be very motivated to get the remaining, $4.9 billion of proceeds of crime which are out there, and they've identified them. So in the same way that Tornado Cash has addresses sanctioned, there's a bunch of addresses that are sanctioned right now due to this Hydra dark web market. There hasn't been any action since April when that press release was made and the arrest was made. So I think there's a good chance that this is an ongoing process and they're going to want to do some type of seizure with those specific funds. And we'll just have to see how it plays out.
In how many years do you think it's more likely than not for a government to directly seize funds on-chain for BTC?
Yeah, so some of the friction in, I mean, there's obviously a lot of like legal hurdles and you're setting precedent in how it works, but there's also like a technical difficulty. So some of the software needed to translate court orders into the code to actually like execute this that the miners would run on their machines is in development. I know someone in this room has actually seen that code. I want to talk to him later about it. So that's in development. I don't know what the timeline is like on the release, but I would be surprised. I mean, for sure, 5 years from now, I'd be very shocked if that wasn't the case. But I think like 2 to 3 years, I feel pretty high confidence that we'll see something like this.
What do you think happens to the value of BTC or the popular version of Bitcoin if funds are seized on-chain?
Yeah, so that gets to kind of like at Unbounded, our core insight was that decentralization isn't the best value prop. There's a much bigger value prop out there of this efficiency micropayment solution for the internet. But it's also not a great value prop if it just doesn't even deliver. So like they've made enormous sacrifices at BTC in particular, but really every other blockchain that's out there has made these design choices to cater to this idea of we're decentralized, that's our value, we're unconfiscatable, unseizable, whatever the word is. If that is revealed to just not be the case on the grandest scale, which would be BTC, I think that's pretty devastating for their value prop. You know, they've already sacrificed efficiency, instant transfers, a lot of these like former value props, and they're kind of left now just with censorship resistance. So I think it would be a major event, and they'd have to kind of scramble and reframe like, what is this all about, you know?
So you've heard it from Dave, from Unbounded. We think within the next 5 years, there are likely to be assets seized on-chain for BTC, and that will have a devastating consequence to the asset price. If that doesn't happen, you can blame Dave and not me. Dave, thank you.
Thank you.